I'm Tom Gleason. I'm currently the Vice President of Public Relations for Forest City. We're the master developer at Stapleton. But back in the days of Coors Field, I was the Deputy Director for the Denver Metropolitan Major League Baseball Stadium District. John Lehigh was the Executive Director, and I was responsible for governmental relations, media relations, and community relations, which is really a great breadth of activities every single day. And starting from the very beginning, before, of course, the ballpark was under construction, and through the first season, I was privileged to really be involved in so many different aspects. In a little way, there are obviously people who played much more important role than I. But it was one of the great experiences of my life, and I think about some of the stories. One of my favorite stories was when I was at City Hall. The reporters that I dealt with were all very aggressive, to say the least, back in those days. And there was 2 newspapers, and so there were a lot of newspaper battles, et cetera, going along. And there were really some hard-nosed reporters that I dealt with. When I left there and I went over to the Stadium District, I would occasionally get calls from some of those reporters. And they would start out in the same kind of gruff manner. They would say, all right, Gleason, we want to find out what you're doing about this or what you're doing about that, or how you're spending this money and how you're spending that money, how can you justify this, and do you have an MWE program, things of that sort. And then they would pause and they'd say, I want to come down and see what you're doing down there. And then they'd pause and they'd say, and would you mind if I bring my son? And it was so clear that this was a very special animal. I think the other thing that was very unique is that we were in what I call the slipstream of building DIA. And that because a lot of those investigative reporters were so wrapped up in covering DIA that they basically just drove right past our construction site on the way out to DIA, I always say, and really did not go into the baseball coverage in a way that they might have done any other project. But there is that emotional piece that, can I bring my son along? And I was always, of course, happy to do that. It was such a great project to talk about. I remember one of the great stories, though, was that the general public was so anxious for the ballpark to be finished and to go in and start using it. And one day, we were about probably maybe less than 50% through with the construction, and there was a lot of steel being erected and things of that sort. The playing surface, of course, hadn't even been finally graded and was pretty rough, etc. And a young man came into my office one day in his early 20s, and he said, my girlfriend and I met in baseball, and I want to ask her to marry me. Is there any way I can get you to allow me to ask her to marry me at home plate? And I rolled my eyes and I thought, oh man, I can just see if this gets out, we'll have so many requests from people who want to do the same thing. But it was something about his pitch that just caught me at the right time, the right moment. So I said, okay. So I said, tell her that you're bringing her down on Tuesday for a tour of the ballpark. And we gave a lot of tours during construction, as much as we possibly could. So I met them outside the gate on the day that we had discussed, and gave them hard hats, and I took them down, and I was showing them around different things that were going on. And then I said, okay, now here's where we are right now, and this is where home plate will be. But you really shouldn't be down here because it's a construction site. There's a lot of danger. We've got a lot of steel in the area, steel beams sort of flying with cranes, etc. So I said, stay right here. Do not move. I've got to go over and check something over in the Rockies dugout area. So he said, okay, we won't move. So I walk over to where the Rockies dugout area was being excavated, and I sort of ducked behind a wall to give them a little bit of privacy. And after a few minutes, I looked out to see how he was doing, and he was just standing there talking. And there was no sign that anything special had gone on at all. And I thought, did he lose his nerve? Is this all for nothing? All of a sudden, she throws her arms around his neck and gives him this passionate kiss. And I figured it was at that point that he asked her. Well, all of our crane operators, of course, were connected by radio. And all the radio staff going, what the hell's going on down there? Because they had seen all this going on at home plate. But it really spoke volumes about how special the place was, and I never ceased to be amazed at how much people really wanted this ballpark and really wanted baseball, and so it was great to be part of that.
Well, I know one of the challenges were, Tom, that in order to get this bill through the legislature, we had to make sure that there was no fiscal note on it, which means no money attached. And of course, the Stadium Authority had work to do before the election, because in order for an election to pass, they needed some detailed information about where's it going to be, what's it going to cost. So how did you all deal with that?
As you said, it is a very big challenge. And going back a step further, of course, is that it had to be somewhere in the 6-county metro area, which of course now is 7 with Broomfield. But and the question was going to be which of the counties was going to submit sites. And there was the speculation, or at least the anticipation, was that it was going to be more than just Denver. Everybody knew that Denver was going to submit, but there was uncertainty about where else it might be. And as it turned out, of course, it was just 3 sites that were submitted by Denver. But that helped narrow things down a little bit. The infrastructure costs, as you point out, things like that were very major questions that were raised, and the fact that it was coming into Denver that had much of the infrastructure in place as the major center of the metropolitan area, that helped a lot. But there was still a lot of issues that I would hesitate to say that we asked them just to trust us, but in effect that's what they had to do, I think, in many cases. And that's very difficult to ask an elected official to do something like that, because that can come back and really hurt you in the end. So those kinds of issues we were really sort of trying to address one at a time, and try to put in some kind of framework around what the team would be required to pay. Of course, costs of maintaining and operating the ballpark were very important, et cetera. So what we tried to do was, first of all, not oversell it, not to create expectations that were unrealistic. But there were certain things, like at the time the seating capacity was going to be adjusted upward from what it was. And we wanted to make sure that the Rockies had to bear those additional costs of creating a larger ballpark. So to answer your question, it was a very, very difficult sale. And in some cases, we were really asking people to trust us.
Were you involved in the design at all?
Yes, yeah. And HOK was terrific. They, because they had done other ballparks, certainly Camden Yards, we went to Camden Yards with HOK. Joe Spear was the principal architect there. There's a funny story about that as well. There was a major meeting at the Denver Chamber of Commerce on Market Street one day. And I'm trying to remember exactly how it came to this point, but it was a major crossroads where people were who were very skeptical about the design, whether there would be buildings incorporated on the site like they did at the ballpark in Camden Yards, etc. And so as we went into the room with HOK, there were probably about 40 people sitting around that large conference room there, and it was very intense. And so Joe Spear started making the presentation, and I was sitting off to his left, and I was watching the crowd around the table, and you could see them at first. They were very rigid in their body and language, but then you could see them start to relax, and then you saw them get to the point where some of them were even having smiles. And I thought, we're winning this, because Joe was doing such a great job talking about the design of this ballpark. But as he was wrapping up, and HOK, of course, in those days, as I say, was working in a variety of cities. Joe Spears says, and that's why we're sure that people here in Cleveland will love this ballpark.
Just checking to see if you're paying attention.
Well, actually, I'm not sure. I think because of course they did the Jake, and they did Comiskey Park, or the new Comiskey Park, and they did Camden Yards, etc. And I thought, oh no, he was doing so well until that point. But he corrected himself. We had a good laugh, and etc. But it was. There were moments like that stand out, because they were turning points, or they could have been turning points, and they could have gone the wrong way.
So was it always going to be a brick facade?
Well, once we knew where the location was going to be, as you remember, there was basically the Pepsi Center site, and then there was the Denver Public Works site at 13th and Decatur, and then there was this site. And this site was not considered to be the favorite, but there were some of the people in the ballpark neighborhood, what was later ballpark neighborhood, Carl Seidel and others, that were pushing for something down there. And then once this site was selected, then I think HOK saw really the opportunity to make it very authentic and pick up so many of the themes of basically an historic warehouse district. And so we have what they call the barrel, that canopy over at 21st and Blake, and you had some other elements as well, and you had the stone base and the brick and things of that sort that really took their cue from the surrounding area. And that's why I think sometimes people who don't know the history of this, when they come down there, they think it's been there much longer than it has, because it looks very much like the other buildings in the area. So once the site was selected, that really gave HOK a good sense on what they wanted to do.
So one of the things that we've heard earlier, Tom, is that there were 3 stadiums that were built about the same time. One a year before Coors Field, one after a year after Coors Field, and that since then they're being torn down.
Yeah.
What do you think? Why do you think Coors Field is experiencing longevity that some of the others aren't?
I think because it comes across as very authentic. I wouldn't want to say anything negative about some of the others that are being torn down, but I think the fact is that Coors Field responded so well to the environment around it. I think it's very fan friendly. I think it's been maintained well because the Rockies believe, and so they always say that it's sort of the Disney experiences that you want, first class experiences. So their maintenance of it has made it, and I think the site is just so perfect, because one of my big challenges at the time, there were some people who were unhappy that we had not more than, I think it was, I don't know, 27 or 2,900 designated parking spots on the property. And I had to say, this is one of the trust me things, I had to say, this is a concept where people will very quickly find that it's not a football experience where you drive, you have a tailgate, you go in, you come out, you go home. This will be something that people will feel is the kind of place that they can walk to, and because of the way it's situated, it works very well with lower downtown. And one of the classic elements of it was a gentleman that I knew who was the executive director of the Downtown Rotary Club, and he lived out in Wheat Ridge, and he told me that when he went to his first game and he walked from the ballpark down to the 16th Street Mall, he said, I've been coming down this area for years, and he said, I never noticed these buildings down here, and some of them are really great. Well, that's exactly what we wanted, and so I would tell people like John Hickenlooper, for instance, who was skeptical initially, that this will bring people into downtown as pedestrians that will allow them to look around and enjoy the history that's very authentic. So I think that's part of the reason. And then also the design, to HOK's credit, there was a different design in Camden Yards. It was a closed concourse, so that when you're out buying a hot dog or something like that and you hear the crowd erupt, you could only look through portals to see the field. Comiskey Park is really changed since the opening, but initially one of the things we liked was the concept of an open concourse. We could walk around, enjoy the game from all these different perspectives. So all those things came together, I think, in a way, and I've always said there is an element of dumb luck in every successful story, and I think the fact that a lot of these pieces that came together, certainly with very, very supportive baseball fans who were starved for Major League Baseball, made it possible.
Right. Who had the idea to get some art in there and put the Columbines on the building?
The Columbine is an interesting story. Barry Rose was the artist, local guy. And I wish I could tell you how I knew we were introduced to Barry, but I remember the day that John Lehigh went down to meet him. He was working out of a small studio down on Colfax. It was right near the cathedral, so about Colfax and Grant or someplace like that. And John, when he went in there, was very skeptical, but Barry very quickly did a great job of demonstrating what he could do. And I wish I knew who suggested the Columbine. Obviously, it's a state flower. It's something that is very important to Colorado. And sometimes people don't remember that it's not only up in those bricks that are up above, but it's on that on the sidewalk going into the first base entrance there. So I'm not sure how that piece came together, but when we saw what Barry was proposing, it just seemed like it made a lot of sense, and so it was a natural.
Do you know who proposed the ball arch? How that happened?
That was Lonnie Hansen. That was part of the public art program, and that was something I really had to learn because I had not been involved in a public art program before, and I thought that, again, this gets back to the question about how you keep the public dollars to be expended only in those areas most appropriate. I thought that what we would do with public art was to get it donated. And so you would find somebody who had quite a reputation and had the backers that would donate pieces of art, et cetera. Well, I found out that in Denver, the public art program, it was not run that way. What they wanted was a competitive process. And so they did, I'd have to go back and research all the particulars on it, but basically it was a call to artists who wanted to participate. Lonnie, I think, had grown up out in Wheat Ridge and came up with that. And when I saw that, and the word that's quite often used for public art is whimsical. In other words, it kind of makes you smile. It's not what you expect. And so I think that's Lonnie's piece of work there at the entrance there down the left field line was something that people really didn't expect. They expected things that might have been, a bronze statue of a baseball player swinging or something like that. But with all the different tiles and the play on words, the ball and things of that sort, it was the kind of thing that I think really responded to a parent who was showing things to a child, and the kids felt they were funny. They were, they wanted to understand what that one meant and that one, and so it engaged people and gave them reason to linger right there on that concourse connection to downtown in a way that just worked very well.
So keeping on the subject of art, so do you know how the statue at the home plate entrance came about?
That was actually done after I left, so it was done sometime after the first season ended. I think that's the George Lundeen, I think. And when I was getting involved with the public art program, Denver has a public art program where you have to spend a certain percent on the arts. I thought that George Lundeen would be a natural because of his work. I was aware of it, and I thought he's the kind of person, because he's got backers who really appreciate his work, that would donate it, and so there wouldn't need to be any funds expended. And I found out that there was an expectation in Denver that it'd be an open, competitive process, etc. But that was added sometime after I left.
So you conducted a lot of tours of the stadium.
Yes.
For out-of-state people, for in-state people. How'd you coordinate all that, and how many did you have?
I would like to say it was coordinated, but it wasn't, and sometimes it was a madhouse. One of the great people that I love, and somebody that you'll remember from the legislature, of course, was Regis Groff. And Regis really God bless him, was a baseball fan of great proportions. He was a Chicago Cub fan, unfortunately. But Regis would come down, and we had given members of the legislature hard hats, et cetera, and at the groundbreaking. And Regis would come down and just kind of stroll through the gate with his hard hat on. And one of the guards asked me one time, they said, who's that guy over there? And I just explained who it was, and he said, I thought he was one of the owners, because when he comes down here, it's like he owns the place. So those were those kinds of tours. Jerry McMorris was terrific. He would sometimes bring people down, and it could be challenging. I think Mary McMorris brought down their grandchild, Madeline, who I think they had named as one of the concession stands after. But it was something that really made me gulp, because it was at a time, with OSHA and things of that sort, that you really shouldn't be allowing somebody with a small child who was in a carrier, I think, at the time to get on. So I'd like to say that it was coordinated, but it wasn't. And I had a hard time saying no to anybody, because I knew there was so much excitement about seeing not only the finished project, but seeing it in process.
So how many tours did you give?
Oh God, I couldn't imagine. Oh yeah. I think, I was with the Stadium District. They hired me in December of '91, and I worked through the first season, so that was the end of '95. Obviously, once the ballpark opened and the Rockies took over a good deal of that, although I was still they would ask me from time to time to give tours, I think hundreds easily. And each one I tried to respond to different interests that people might have. Sometimes you could get a sense that people were interested in the architecture. Sometimes it would be the history. I used to like to point out that the lighting on the concourse would be the old gooseneck lamps that would bend down, and so it wasn't backlit. It was the old-fashioned lighting. I'm trying to remember. I think it was probably on one of the tours one day when one of the workmen came up to me who was doing the excavation in the area of the Rockies dugout, and he said, I want to show you what we found. And he gave me 2 or 3 bones, only about 6 inches long. He said, we found these there. And I knew that we had an obligation to make sure that it wasn't something of historic significance. And so I said, okay, I'll go out now to the Museum of Nature and Science and I'll go out there, and I anticipated that they were going to laugh at me. I thought for sure that when I handed him the bones, he would look at me and say, well, let's see, Colonel Sanders, they're about 2 weeks old. But he looked at him and very quickly just handed it back to me and said, 66 million years old. Those are dinosaur.
Wow.
I can't remember whether it was part of the rib cage or something like that. And then what was funny about that is that obviously we wanted to be very careful and respectful and do everything that was part of our obligation in terms of carrying forth with the excavation in that area where they were found. So they sent out two, I like to describe them as two good old boys. They were two, I guess they were geologists that had worked for the museum on a number of different projects, and they were out there, and so we'd have backhoe equipment or whatever do some excavation and pull back, and then these guys would go in with brushes and things of that sort to check to see if there's anything there. So I had a conversation with him one time, and I said, so how valuable are these bones? He says, well, he says, the bones are not, you can't really tell a lot about that particular dinosaur from those bones. The most valuable thing, of course, would be to find the skeleton or the skull. He said, the second thing is valuable is a tooth, if it's a dinosaur's tooth. And I said, oh, really? That's interesting. And he said, yeah. He said, you know, a dinosaur's tooth looks exactly like dried bird crap. And I said, and he said, you know how you know the difference? And I said, no. And he says, you pop it in your mouth. If it melts, it's not a dinosaur tooth. So I think that was one of the things that we discovered on it. That was when the tour was in progress, and so it was fun to be able to tell those stories. And of course, that was the birth of Dinger later on.
Exactly. And you had one fun experience when you invited my group out for a tour. Maybe you could quickly tell that.
I did indeed, and when you were nice enough to bring your mom out and your son and asked to be shown the progress, because obviously you knew a lot about the ballpark and the stages of it, et cetera. But your mom didn't want to go up the ramp because she thought it was a little bit taxing, and so you and your son went up. And I said, I'll stay here down here with your mom. And so we started talking. And I said, are you from Colorado? She said, oh, from Chicago. I said, oh, so am I. She said, where? And I said, South Side, Emerald Avenue. And she looked at me like I was kidding her. And she said, Emerald Avenue. What was the address? And I said, 9612. And she said, we lived at 96-1. Because I think you had the corner house, right. If I recall. So we had a great conversation about that, and one of the things that I just to this day I'm so appreciative of her. I got back to the office, and I think it was only a day or two later that there was a cassette with an old black and white video of your birthday party, 5th birthday party. My mother, who had been dead for a couple of years, was there as a 40-year-old woman, and it was just so wonderful. So that, in many ways, was the highlight of my experience there, non-baseball, of course, related.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Talking about the field and finding the Triceratops bones there, tell me a little bit about home plate. I know it was a challenge because the Stadium Authority wasn't given the power of eminent domain in the legislation. And also tell me, how is it that you came to that location and that siting for home plate?
Well, first of all, the question was whether home plate should be at that, I mean, it's got to be on a north-south axis, and so, I mean, obviously you don't want the batter looking into the sun and things of that sort. So it was going to be one of two places, where it is or what would be center field. And a lot of it is programmatic in the sense that, okay, if you figure out, okay, we want to have the clubhouses here, you've got some the beer distribution lines and all the things related to preparation of the concessions, et cetera, all those kinds of things sort of drive how a ballpark is laid out. But then the basic question was, do we want people looking out to what would be mountain views or looking to downtown? And there are a lot of people who thought, well, so many ballparks, to underscore that they are urban ballparks, face downtown. But we thought the views out to the west were important as well. And so once we made that decision, and then, as I say, the program drove it, and it was a GPS type of process in which they identified this exact point had to be home plate. So in other words, so that you could lay out the dimensions down the line. Of course, 347 down the left field line, and whatever it is I've forgotten, down the right field line. And then also how close home plate was to the seating bowl behind it. And as I recall, the distance between home plate at Coors Field and the first row of seats behind it is the shortest distance, with perhaps one exception, in all Major League Baseball. So all those things had to come together, and obviously you want the aesthetics, you want the experience, but it's got to function. You know, I mean, if you did something that was going to give you a great view, but it didn't allow the ballpark to function, then that just wouldn't work. So it's a combination of different things.
Wow.
Yeah, and Coors Field is kind of in a basin,
Yes,
and that worked to the advantage of
it was.
lower downtown and,
Yeah.
and the ballpark.
We wanted pedestrians to enter the ballpark on the main concourse, which is what they did, and so then it's a question of how you accommodate the lower seating bowl, the upper area, et cetera, and the upper deck, I should say. So all those things are really can be a little like engineering questions more than anything else, and so they can be very mundane. They can be very technical in nature. But hopefully you keep in mind as you make those decisions the things that the fans will actually see and experience, and that was always a major consideration.
So from a construction project standpoint, not having eminent domain, and it was my understanding that most of the ground was acquired except for that location at home plate. So what kind of challenges did that present to you that we had to start construction, but we didn't have it tied down on the location?
You're absolutely right, and that was a very big challenge. And there's healthy skepticism in Colorado, and I think rightfully so, about giving government eminent domain authority for fear that it'll be abused, and we've seen over the years that that's happened. And so there certainly was in this case as well. And the stadium district was a new entity; it didn't have a track record, and so that there were a lot of things that I think caused very reasonable questions in the legislature. So we were not given eminent domain authority. As you point out, most of the land was a single owner in terms of Union Pacific. There were smaller parcels. But like Sandlot Brewery was in the Student Movers building, and we had to acquire that. But the family that owned basically the home plate entrance knew that their piece was absolutely critical. And so we were torn between trying to strike the very best deal, because, again, we were using taxpayer dollars, and doing what was fair to a family that had owned that parcel for many years, I think. And so it went back and forth, and it was getting to the point that it looked like the only way we were going to resolve it was to have eminent domain authority. So we went back to the legislature, and I remember Senator Gallagher was one of the people that was really resistant about that. But we ended up going to negotiations, and a judge basically split it down the middle, as I recall, in terms of what the family had asked, what we thought was the demonstrated market value there. And so it was resolved, and obviously that was very key.
I know we were in one of the deepest recessions that we've had in Colorado at the time we were looking at moving this issue forward. And at the same time, certainly we were doing construction on DIA. The Denver Public Library was another public works project, and I know there was a lot of discussion around, would there be enough concrete, would there be enough labor? How did you deal with those issues?
We were worried about that. You're absolutely right, and that was at a time when it's for all the reasons that you just cited in terms of the recession, et cetera. The questions were what's going to be the cost? I mean, if you're talking about, for instance, paving a roadway with concrete or with asphalt, what would it cost us to use to concrete, which would last a little bit longer? Is there going to be enough steel, for instance, and things of that sort? And those were things that somehow worked out. I can't claim to know in every particular instance what happened. Labor was interesting. We had most of it was, as I recall, non-union labor, but we had an issue with one of the electrical unions when we brought in. We had a non-union contractor doing work already, for some reason or other, I don't recall, we had to bring in another contractor, and this one was union, and so they established a dual gate, which meant that their members were not allowed to come in the same gate as the non-union members. And so you've got all these things that you're juggling in the air, and as I say, in any successful story, there's dumb luck, and apparently we had enough dumb luck that we pulled it off.
Right. Well, the election was August of '90, and then we were selected in July of '91. And, I mean, that's when the clock really started ticking.
Yeah.
Did you ever have any doubt that the stadium could get done?
Every day. And I remember on opening day, the railings were still being painted, and you worried that a fan's first experience would be to grab a railing and end up with paint on my hand. Yeah, every day. And over time, and you might recall that there were certain things changed out, the foul poles, for instance, which seemed to be a good design, ended up blocking too many fans' views, and they really didn't need to block it. So those were replaced. The backstop was one. It was originally a silver sheen that was at a certain point in the game, the light made it almost impossible to see through. There was always a discussion about whether that the backstop ought to be extended down the line, because of course when you go to a game there and you see people sitting right behind the Rockies dugout, for instance, sometimes they're not paying as much attention as they might because they can get a foul ball or a bat headed their way. So a lot of those things were things that were actually changed after the first season. You live and you learn. There's no question about that. And I think, to the Rockies' credit, again, because they're driven by quality of the fan experience, that probably motivated some of the changes.
So one of the mandates of the legislation was that the stadium authority needed to hold educational type meetings in each of the counties.
Mm-hmm.
Were you a part of those meetings?
Oh, yeah,
And
every one of them.
what kind of things were you hearing at those meetings?
Well, first of all, we had at one point decided we needed a model, and I can't remember how much this thing weighed, but it was about almost half the size of this conference table. And we made a schedule to deliver that model to, like, a library, for instance, a major library in each one of the 6 counties, so people could come and see it. But I remember I had all the architects' boards and things of that sort, and I would go out and I would talk to anybody who would listen. Chambers of Commerce and sports groups and whatever it might be. And what you often heard was sort of an anti-Denver bias. Why should Denver get this? It seems to me that I heard that more in Douglas County, but it might have been Arapahoe County. But it broke really 2 ways. In some ways, people said, we're always battling Denver on different issues. Whether it's medical care for the indigent, whether it's air quality issues, whatever it might be. And so there was that animosity there that Denver was getting something. But then none of those other counties submitted sites. And it's because, I think, is that many of them knew that they were not ready for a major sports facility the way that Denver already was, given the fact that Denver already had them. But my main message to them was, this will be, especially if I was talking, I love to talk to like a Rotary Club, for instance, where you're talking to people of a certain age who would be bringing their grandchildren to there. And I would say, how many of you grew up in Denver? And quite often a minority of the people in the room had. So they had come from other cities. And I'd say, think back if you grew up in Chicago, or if you grew up in Brooklyn, or places like that where you had old-time ballparks. Do you remember going with your dad, your grandfather, et cetera? And you could appeal to their memories and their emotions, et cetera, in ways that would help get them over the hump of maybe feeling like this shouldn't be in Denver, it should be in our county, especially if Denver hadn't voted for it and the other counties had approved it, or if Denver wasn't providing as much revenue as another county. All those things were things that I had to somehow try to get them people to accept, and in return expect that they're going to have an experience that was going to make it worthwhile.
So were you happy you were involved in this whole process?
Oh, loved it. I loved it, absolutely. And one of the things I haven't even talked about is that the community process in lower downtown was pretty elaborate, if you will. There's a woman by the name of Barb Chadwick, you might remember, from the city of Denver. She's been there for a long time and has handled, I think, has coordinated community stuff on every major project. We worked with Barr on the Downtown Ballpark Development Committee and ended up producing a report about this big. And it addressed things like, for instance, concerns that and there weren't many people living in the area at that time, that the ballpark would be a major source of noise problems, and that there would be a lot of rock concerts there. That baseball was just going to be a certain number of days of the year, but the Grateful Dead were going to come through, or the Fish, and all this kind of thing. And so we had to address all those kinds of things. They played a role in the architecture. There were people in the city of Denver's Department of Planning that did a great job, I think, of making sure that the architects and HOK understood sort of the history of the area and some of the reason for some of the architecture, et cetera. So it was a very elaborate process, consumed a lot of time, but it was worth it in the end. And so, yes, it was a great project to be involved in, and I just enjoyed even just driving by, just recalling some of those memories.
So how did that one building get incorporated into the stadium?
Primarily because I think the expectation was, given that we had the same firm that had incorporated the B&O warehouse in Camden Yards, that the same thing should be done in Denver. And this building, the old Student Movers building at the time, was not of the quality of the B&O warehouse, certainly in scale and architecture and things of that sort. But interestingly enough, I don't know that the B&O warehouse has worked out as well as people wanted. The anticipation there was that you'd have a stadium club there and things of that sort. But the B&O warehouse has windows that are relatively small. So if you're sitting there having dinner, you don't really have a great chance to look into the field. It's really more of an architectural thing. And the whole thing with baseball, at least in my estimation, that was important, was creating a sense of intimacy. And that's one of the things the B&O warehouse did. It sort of defined down the right field line and right field to center field. Student Movers, I think, offered us the same opportunity to do that. We actually cut the corner off so that it fit in well with the concourse. We were basically trying to do what they had done so successfully in Baltimore.
Well, talking about the meetings you had in communities and this resistance to Denver and no submissions of a site from the outlying counties, I know that the conversation I had with most mayors and commissioners were the great amount of investment that it would take in infrastructure, particularly transportation. And I know at the time Coors Field was being built that Federico Pena was no longer mayor of Denver, but was Secretary of Transportation in the big viaduct project.
Yeah.
How much do you think that enhanced the experience of being able to get in and out of Coors Field?
Yeah, it certainly is a necessary part. I'm not sure I would use the word enhance the experience. Obviously, you want any sports venue to be able to accept people coming and then leaving as smoothly as possible, because if it's a nightmare, they won't do that. They won't come and enjoy the experience. I think that Pena's, although at the same time he was getting the money for DIA, and so his hands were pretty well filled. Well, actually, now that I think about it, he got the money, the first $500 million for DIA from the Airport Trust Fund when Sam Skinner was the Secretary of Transportation. And so it was his predecessor. But I think he was pretty dogged and determined in working the funding sources back there to address certain things. We were always concerned in Denver that our viaducts were aging. I remember the old Spear Viaduct was a very dangerous place to be. 20th Street certainly was. And 23rd Street Viaduct needed to be built. And so there were things like that needed to be addressed. And again, they're not sexy, but they were necessary. And he worked very hard at getting the money, but he had a lot of great support from the business community. I think he would be the very first to say that it wasn't just the city of Denver, but it was a very strong community support that was necessary.
So do you have any background knowledge of why we have trees or spruce trees in the outfield?
Yeah, that was always, and obviously, I mean, the first thing is that the batter's eye is something that is the league is very prescriptive about. It's got to be a solid background so you can distinguish a fastball coming in at 100 miles an hour. And so then the question became, okay, so you just have a green wall there, or do you do something that, and I think this in many ways is for the TVs. You know, they show the beauty shots, and they'll show the blue spruces, and I think they still have like a little stream out there or something along those lines. And so again, it was part of an effort to say this is Colorado. And again, the time zone without a baseball team, and so to make sure that people who tuned in from around the country and watched games on TV saw something special that they wouldn't see in Pittsburgh or Atlanta or someplace like that.
So your bottom line, you're saying the reason they have trees in center field is to spruce it up?
I've never heard that line. I wish did I use that one?
No, but I've used it for years.
So I know when we were talking earlier, Tom, you had mentioned that I was doing a lot of talk radio
Yes.
talking about why this would be a positive thing. And one of the things that I heard is that we were going to displace all of the homeless who had cardboard living facilities down there. Do you want to comment on the transformation of Lodo?
Yeah, well, first of all, when you talk just about the Union Pacific property, and of course the Union Pacific building itself, for instance, there were not a lot of people living there. I think there was sort of an expectation that if you went down there, you'd find a lot of what they would call hobos and things of that sort, and there really was not a lot of that. But in the area in downtown, the question was, is this going to be overall beneficial in a number of different respects? And one of my concerns is that downtown, especially that part, was just starting to become an area attractive to residential development. Younger people who wanted to come down and live in lofts, they didn't mind the fact that you were going to have baseball games there because it was all part of the excitement of being downtown and things of that sort. So I don't think we ever really displaced a lot of people who were homeless. At least I never got much criticism for that. I worked with the merchants along Larimer Street, though, which in those days was known as Skid Row. And these merchants, God bless them, had been there for decades and had been putting up with a lot of the problems with street alcoholics. And so once or twice a year, I would, when they had their cleanups on the street, and I would go help them with the things you saw down there, needles and human waste and all this kind of stuff. That was of major concern. Bob Cote, who is no longer with us but ran Step 13, saw an opportunity, and he had there still is a facility near 20th and Blake that serves is tough love for street alcoholics who want to turn their lives around. And he was somebody who saw an opportunity. And he started providing a service that you could park. He had a relatively small lot park there, and then his guys, who he always wanted to work for, the opportunity to live there, would detail your car, wash it and polish it and things of that sort. So there was one of the quote-unquote homeless entities down there that really saw an opportunity to do what was part of their mission, and that is give people a personal responsibility to help with their lives. The others, I'm sure there were some that would say that we displaced people, but I did not hear a whole lot of that.
Great.
Wonderful job.
Fantastic. Great job.
Fun. Thank you for asking me. It's wonderful to talk about. And, just thinking about it, it reminds me of things that I had forgotten about over the years. And one of the things, the manual scoreboard, people love that. And the Denver Press Club would have a fundraiser every year, the Damon Runyon Dinner. And one of the things that I worked with the Rockies was to get a gift certificate that you could go down there and work an inning and change the manual scoreboard
really?
from that. And that was one of the most popular things they ever had in their lives. So,
Really?
yeah.
So what do you think about the party deck these days?
First of all, I've never been up there, so I can't really say. I am surprised. I have a friend who is a very serious baseball fan. And I said, so how are the views up there the first season? And he said, you really can't see. But he says, you watch it on a monitor. And I was thinking, well, why would you go up there? So, and I don't know whether the Mountain Ranch Club ever produced the results that they expected it to.
It did at the beginning.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
it kind of slowed down.
Yeah, so I think there are certain things. Sandlot Brewery, for instance, the question was, is that going to be open every day, non-baseball days, et cetera? You remember there was discussion about whether there should be a baseball museum. And the Rockies had some great memorabilia, and not only from themselves, but they'd acquired over the years from some of their people. And so there are certain things that you think to yourself, not everything materialized the way we had hoped, but that's like everything in life. And I think overall, people are pretty happy with it.
So, do I remember this correctly, or maybe it's just a figment of my imagination, that either opening day or the day before opening day, that there was a pipe that burst? Was it the Coors beer line,
I think you're right, but I can't remember the specifics on that. I do remember that the night the last flight took off from Stapleton was February 28th, 1995, I think. That was the night that we turned on the lights for the first time. And I remember the media was so mad because they said, how can you give us two major events to cover at one time? And so most of them went up to cover the last flight out at Stapleton, and then they raced down to be there as we were adjusting the lights and things of that sort. I remember one of the first games when there was a problem with one of the urinals spitting out water. At least I hoped it was water. and I had to go down and make sure that that was taken care of, because the stadium district's offices, of course, were in the student movers building. And so we literally I'd walk out of my office and be in the ballpark. And so you were there to respond to those kinds of things. But I think that reminds me, and I'm not sure why it reminds me of this, but one of the great things was the delegations that came from other cities, including the Yankees. At the time when they were thinking about changing Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
And they sent some of the, I'm trying to remember who was all in the delegation, but I remember that a major part of their delegation was the New York Police Department, and they were concerned about safety issues and whether they should move Yankee Stadium from a neighborhood where it was to a place that was more safe. It was a safer place to be. So all those things are going to come back. Those memories come flooding back, and it was a great time.
Thank you very much, Tom.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to get a hold of anybody else you haven't been able to reach and you think I can help you reach them, let me know. I'll be glad to help you.
John Lehigh is one of those individuals